Welcome everyone to the latest I4CP Next Practices Weekly call. We have these every Thursday. Great to see so many returning names and faces, and some new folks that I don't think have joined us before. So good to see you. Folks are still filing in. If you could open up the chat, let us know where you're dialing in from today, where you're joining. I've seen folks from both ends of Canada, Vancouver and Nova Scotia. I've seen folks from all sorts of different areas around the U.S. If you're from outside the U.S. or Canada, would love to hear where you're joining us from today. We often get folks from different areas of Europe, South America sometimes. Great to have you all with us. Again, this is the Next Practices Weekly call series from I4CP. If you're not familiar with I4CP, we are the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We're a human capital research firm. We discover the people practices that drive high performance. What we mean by high performance, and this comes up a lot in our research, are organizations that excel in four areas: revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction. And what we like to do in our surveys when we do the analysis is tease out what the top quartile companies, those high performers, are doing differently in their HR practices than the lower quartile, that bottom 25%. We'll be sharing some data throughout the call today on a wide range of topics. We've got a bit of a special session today, so a little bit more on that in a moment. Again, for those of you that are new to I4CP, we are a member-driven organization. Here's just a small sample of our many member companies. You see they range across all different industries. We've got areas from the federal government, nonprofits as well. They also range across not only different market verticals, but different size organizations. We've got the very large companies like Amazon and Accenture, and then many that are on the smaller side. We've also got a healthy cohort of unicorns, upstart organizations that are members of I4CP. So if you're on the call today and you're with an I4CP member, special welcome to you. Glad you could join us. If you'd like to learn more about I4CP membership, you can reach out to us through our website, i4cp.com, or any of us on the call from the company, and we'd be happy to have that conversation. My name's Tom Stone. I'm a senior research analyst here at I4CP, and I'm the sort of regular co-host for these Thursday calls. I'll be introducing two more of my colleagues here in just a moment, and we're going to have an interesting conversation around priorities and predictions, doing sort of a mid-year check-in from where we're at, since we're almost at the mid-year point in 2023. But a few other quick reminders. As I've said, this is a weekly call, the Next Practices Weekly series. You see the sessions we'll have coming up. We'll have Sarah Hansen from Dutch Bros, Maren Wagner from Walmart, two outstanding organizations there. We're going to take the 4th of July week off. In the United States, of course, that is a holiday week, so there won't be any session on the 6th, but we'll be back on July 13th. Where two of our colleagues, Kevin Oakes and Molly Lombardi, will be sharing some of the latest research we have that we're calling the productivity predicament. Easy for me to say, a little bit of a tongue twister there, but a clever title for our latest research in that area. Speaking of the latest research, we have just launched, I believe either last night or today, our latest study on a very timely topic, AI and HR, implications and opportunities. So please, no matter what organization you're with, click on the link that will be put in the chat here shortly. Take the survey after the call today. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love your data to be included in the survey. You will get, I believe, two things from this survey this time. Not only will you get the sort of wrap-up data that you get as a participant, which we've always given as a thank you for participants in our surveys, but I believe we're trying something new with this survey where there'll be some degree of real-time data provided back to you as participants. I see Catherine nodding her head. She's the lead researcher on this study. So an extra reason to participate in this one. And thank you, Zeta, for putting that link. It's at research.net. That's the service we use through SurveyMonkey for all of our major studies. And so I mentioned Catherine's name. Let me introduce my two colleagues who are, you could say, our special guests with me here today. Catherine Brecken has a PhD and is a senior research analyst here on the I4CP team. Good morning, Catherine.
Morning, Tom. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you with us. And Eric Davis has also joined us. We were going to have our VP of Research, Lori Likens, but she developed a member meeting conflict. And so we're very happy to have Eric Davis here. He works very closely with our Chief Diversity Officer board. Each one of our boards has a researcher that works closely with them. So Eric is sort of a expert in that arena. And he also has a superpower on the team in that he's our creative director. So those of you that are members of I4CP or even non-members, if you've ever downloaded any reports or infographics or some of the nicer case studies that we do that aren't just web-based, that's Eric's handiwork that's made them look as professional and good as they are. So special thank you to Eric. And since I'm mentioning superpowers, I suppose I should mention Catherine's. She's not just a senior research analyst like I am on our team. She's also the sort of statistical pro and the one that runs all of our correlation analyses on the team. Definitely has the best skills in that arena. So special thank you to both of you for all that you do at I4CP. All right, I'm going to say a few more words, and then we're gonna bring Eric on to share some insights from our Chief Diversity Officer board. But overall, what we're doing for this session is we're doing a check-in on what we found from our boards, our executive boards, were their priorities and main predictions going into 2023. The report you see here on the right was released in November. It had insights from all 6 of our boards, as well as specific insights from some of the companies you see here on the left. If you've never downloaded this report, it is one of the most heavily downloaded assets from I4CP every year. This is something we do annually. If you didn't get it this year, it's still relevant, even though we're in June, as you'll see as we walk through some of the highlights and give some updates from it on this call. So I'd encourage you to download it. Again, Zeta, thank you for putting the chat link over there. What are our boards? Again, if you're new to I4CP, we have 6 executive level boards. You see them in the areas that they cover here. The photos are from our Next Practices Now conference, which is in March each year in Scottsdale, Arizona. The folks that attend in person there at the conference are only roughly, I'd say, half of the members of each board. Obviously, these are high-level executives. They can't always travel to each in-person meeting. Some folks do attend virtually. So in terms of the size of these boards, just to give you a sense of it, you could roughly measure most of them, probably multiply by 2, and that would be the size of these boards. We're going to spend time on the priorities that each of them indicated last fall. They were really focusing on going into 2023. And to do that, we'll be kicking off with the first one here in just a moment. But I wanted to first just note, overall, across all 6 boards, when we asked them in the fall, in October, what are your critical issues going into 2023? These were the top 5. Talent overall, attraction, retention, and development, the economy, industry-specific challenges, that's always makes the list because each company has their own concerns. Workforce well-being, something that's grown in importance over the past 3-4 years. And then workplace models, still very much on the minds of many organizations, although a bit less so going into 2023 than it was throughout 2021 and 2022. And the interesting thing here that we're noting between that first one and this 5th one, and by the way, there were many more responses as well that just had less than 31% respondents. There's been this sort of shift we saw going into this year, a little less focus on the where of work, still hybrid return to office on a lot of folks' mind, more focus on the skills needed, and again, that attraction, retention, development conundrum that many organizations face with their top talent. So those were sort of the top 5 critical issues across all the boards. And at this point, let's dive into what were some of the priorities, the top priorities for each of the 6 boards in these different areas. I'd like to encourage everyone on the call to keep the chat open. Thank you everyone that introduced yourselves. Ask questions, make comments, add contributions over in the chat as we move along. We're going to be sharing a lot with you today. Again, this is sort of a mid-year check-in on where things are at with people in our organizations. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eric Davis to speak to what the priorities were and are for our Chief Diversity Officers.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everybody. Just want to say I'm pretty excited that we're doing this mid-year check-in. I think it's been kind of a volatile first part of the year, especially for certain functions. And it's great to go back and sort of course correct where people's attention and focus are right now. So when we originally did this study, which was November of last year, the Chief Diversity Officers came up with this list of their top 4 priorities, which was recruitment and retention of diverse talent, increasing buy-in and enterprise-wide buy-in enterprise-wide and refining governments and DE&I efforts, implementing behavioral and competency models to increase inclusive thinking and leadership, and developing a structural response to equitably support reproductive right benefits. Some of these, I would say, have pretty much stayed in place. And overall, I would say that the focus of the strategic plans that people have put in place are going along the same track. The difference is some of the drivers for these have shifted. I think one of the big drivers that have shifted everybody's focus across the board is the sort of explosion of generative AI functions that have come out. And one of the big concerns, and I know one of the big concerns that we've talked about with the Chief Diversity Officer Board, is bias in AI, which is basically an extension of human biases as they go into what kind of data sets are used, how data is collected, how things are set up. And AIs tend to have a really specific kind of way that they need to be approached to look at bias from both the human perspective and from the IT perspective. So when we look at things like recruitment and retention of diverse talent, so at the time that we were taking this survey, there was a lot of shifting around in the workforce. I know that we were having a lot of IT layoffs, and a lot of times in manufacturing, the problem was not being able to find enough talent in the markets that they were looking for. So there was kind of, in one case, a need to retain and to bring in new talent. In another part, there was downsizing going on. So now we're kind of looking through, say, with the lens of AI and bias. If we want to go to the next slide, what kind of disparate impact AI could potentially have on who's participating in the labor market? What jobs are going to be impacted by AI coming in with these skills to be able to take over large swaths of particular roles and really jeopardize employment in those sectors? So our friends at Revelio Labs put out a study just the other day where they found that 71% of employees in the 15 most AI exposed occupations, and this was where they looked at a long set of occupations and picked out the 15 that had the task involved in it that were the most repetitive things that AI could potentially take a large chunk of that job away from current workforce. And they found that 71% of the people that were in those jobs were women. So there's definitely a chance that you could have a disparate impact on employment for women in some of the jobs that AI could be brought in to take over. And then they found that 32.9% of exposed employees are people of color, which was only slightly over the 31.6% average that we have in society, but it's still something that needs to be looked at carefully when we're looking at restructuring jobs around introduction of AI. So,
yeah, pretty impressive difference there, particularly on the gender side, for women. That's a big difference there, 71% for sure.
Definitely. And when we see that, post pandemic, we've seen the resurgence to where women's representation in the workforce is nearly back to what it was pre-pandemic. You don't want to lose those gains now, but in order to keep women in the workforce, in order to keep these jobs from being eliminated completely, there's going to be some upskilling that would be required, because the hope is with AI, and I know that Tom, you and I talk about this a lot because of your work on our previous AI study, that it's not so much about replacing workers as it is augmenting their capabilities to do more value-added work. So I see in chat somebody goes, in what industries exactly are the AI exposed jobs? A lot of these were in support activities. I know that they talked a lot about things like accounting, back-end HR structure even was mentioned as some of the jobs that could have some of the repetitive tasks involved, like benefits administrations, things like that. Office work, some of the administrative assistant work that's out there, because one of the big gaps that AI can tend to fill are administrative assistant tasks. That's where we saw most of it. So let me see, did the study offer any insights on how long we have to upskill these workers? Not necessarily how long, because right now I think we're still getting a handle on what adoption rates are going to be in different organizations. We've seen a definite upward trend of organizations that are now experimenting with different AIs for different roles, but not necessarily putting them into action in the live workforce.
Right. And we'll get a good sense for that question from our study that was mentioned. And again, the link is over in the chat for that, because we specifically asked, like, where are you right now with implementing generative AI in particular, or other aspects of AI that, you know, could be used to either augment human capabilities or in some cases replace workers. So once we get those results from that study that again just went live today, I think we'll have some good data of our own to speak to that question.
Yeah, definitely. But we have seen an uptick in that. Now, the other seismic shift that we've seen, particularly on the CDO front, is they're facing a lot of emerging challenges from the social, political, legal aspect of things. And this has really taken off quite a lot in the last 6 months. And I think it'll probably be a theme that'll go through, at least in the US, through the 2024 election. So, because a lot of it is just tied to political rhetoric and what's going on there. I know that a lot of CDOs are trying to stay above it, stay out of the fray, and continue with the work they're doing, supporting their organization's talent. But at the same time, as you can see from the headlines that I've got here on the right on this slide, that's not always possible. It could be around some particular initiatives that you have in your organization. It could have something to do with just trying to be vocal in support of certain segments of your workforce. Any of these could end up having a backlash right now, which I think a lot of the DE&I world was braced for, because we had a huge surge of interest in DE&I and ESG related topics during the pandemic. There were a lot of pledges made, a lot of advancement going on. And whenever that happens, you pretty much expect there to be a pendulum swing at some point to where backlash will come in and people start challenging what you're doing. So the big thing that we have recommended at I4CP is just to make sure that for all of the programs that you have out there, all of the initiatives that you have ongoing, just make sure that you're pressure testing them, looking at risk mitigation if there's challenges from external forces, coordinate with legal to make sure that you know the environment that's out there and how you can respond to it, and shore up any of your internal support. Just make sure that you have your business case well structured for everything that you're doing. So,
and I know, Eric, that we did a recent pulse survey on the legislation around the country facing the LGBTQ plus community. And last week, Lori was with me and she shared just a few of the findings from that. So if you missed last week's session, you could pull up that recording and learn a little bit from that. And then for any members on the call, I4CP members, we're going to be having a flash call. I believe it's sometime next week, where I4CP members can learn the full results from that pulse survey. And there was a lot more than what we even shared last week.
Yeah, myself and my colleague Carol Morrison will be on that, and we can talk through the full results and see how organizations are dealing with some of the pushback that they've been seeing on the LGBTQ front.
Great. And again, for that call is a flash call for members only. And again, thank you, Zeta, for putting the link there for folks on the call that might be interested in that. Wanted to draw attention to these. So thank you, Eric. Those were great insights as sort of an update as to what's facing chief diversity officers and their DE&I teams. We've, of course, had several calls on the DE&I front as part of the Next Practices Weekly series. I wanted to just draw out attention to 3 of them here. We had one recently with Geraldine White from Publicis Group. We had one earlier, in the fall last year with Eloisa Domingo, hope I'm saying that name correctly, from Allstate. All of these are recordings that are available up in the archive, and we're going to be covering similarly for each of the topic areas today. Want to encourage folks, particularly if you're new to this call series, we do record these sessions and they're all available up, going back a couple of years now, up on our website. So if there's a particular company you're interested in, particular topic, particular speaker, definitely peruse the archive and check it out. It's almost like a nice sort of almost podcast archive of all of our sessions. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Catherine. Let's move on to our People Analytics Board and learn a little bit about what their priorities were coming into the year and where things stand for some of their initiatives today.
Thanks, Tom. Yes, Catherine Brecken and I have the lucky job of supporting our People Analytics Board. It's a great group of leaders in the human capital analytics space, and really at the forefront of what organizations are doing with data and how to make data-driven decisions. Really, these were the 4 that surfaced from the priorities and prediction survey that came out in November. Determining the impact and return on investment of emerging work arrangements, enhancing organizations' workforce planning capabilities, increasing speed and agility to turn data into insights to support business strategy, and scale analytical capabilities across HR and the organization. I'm going to address all of these with really 2 topics that are top of mind for people analytics leaders. First, next slide. Thank you, Tom. According to our board, and actually we met Tuesday, where we talked about all of this and how those priorities have changed, and really they're evolving, but they're still top of mind. So remote, hybrid, flexible work is still very much an unsettled issue in organizations across the globe. And you may be sick of hearing about it. Your organizational leaders may be over it, but it's the issue that won't go away. NBC recently reported that Google sent out a memo indicating they're now going to enforce their hybrid policy. Employees must come in 3 days a week to the office or else. And it's HR that will be carrying out the enforcement. So those who don't comply are going to hear from HR on next steps, according to that memo. And in May, of course, we saw Amazon employees staged a walkout, in part to protest the layoffs, but largely also the return to office mandate. And you know what? Amazon didn't seem to care. They cited increased productivity and that collaboration that's been occurring as people come back to the office more often. So during this economic crunch, you're seeing executives push for return to office. And my take on this is that they're going to the mattresses, they're bringing back all the old tools that they know have worked in the past, and setting the right context for those requires people to work the way they did in the past. And that means being seen in the office, right? And so you're seeing this push to return to office from a lot of the major companies that have tried to remain flexible during the pandemic. And you're seeing a dichotomy still emerged. I don't know if you remember that Microsoft 2022 study that found it was 12% of leaders thought that their hybrid employees were being productive, or they were confident in that their employees in hybrid models were productive. And it was 87% of employees felt that they were more productive working remotely. That push-pull is still very much in existence. And employees, even though they're mandated to come back to the office, often aren't, and no one's enforcing it yet. So this big Google announcement, I think is just the start of that hammer that's going to come down. And so the key questions people analytics leaders are thinking about, they're the truth tellers. They've got to find out what's going on with their work arrangement. How is it impacting employees? How is it impacting engagement, attrition, productivity, all of those things. And so these are some of the key questions that they've been thinking about in terms of their evaluation of current work models, because that's what they're being asked to do, is basically, in some cases, being asked to justify a return to office or find support for a hybrid policy. But they really need to look at all of the metrics that they have at their disposal. And their data governance policies are sometimes limiting on what they can and cannot use. But they're sussing out general attendance trends, looking at a difference in attendance by demographics, looking at sort of what are some of the things that don't influence office attendance. And one of my favorites is actually looking at the environmental impact of return to office plans. And I think that those who are doing that are finding their carbon footprint is shrinking with a more flexible plan. And as ESG reporting becomes more important for organizations looking at the EU regulations that are coming down the pipe, that kind of data is going to be really critical and important. So thinking about all the ways in which your work model can affect your business outcomes is what a lot of people analytics leaders are doing. And then, of course, there's a lot of frustration. It's just like politics. You can bring the best data to your executive board, but if they identify with a certain philosophy or a certain ideology, right, it's really hard to convince hearts and minds with numbers. And so you can bring all this data you want, but then at the end of the day, the executives are going to do, the leader's going to do what the leader's going to do. And that is very frustrating for people analytics leaders. They go through a lot of work in presenting that data. The other three main issues that were the priorities at the beginning of the year, all of them, generative AI is applying to and evolving. This is, when I say the opportunities and risks, I think these are what leaders across the board are discussing in terms of implementing generative AI. This is such a nascent field, and very few organizations are mature in doing this, and we're all kind of watching each other. But I've got a great article I'm going to post. It is unfortunately behind the wall for I4CP, how generative AI is transforming people analytics. And we also just introduced a bias audit checklist for AI and algorithms, of course, that Eric mentioned. But like HR has been using AI for years, just not this kind. Generative AI creates text, images, video, and audio using web and other data that it's been trained on. And that's creating a bunch of, really anomalies or paradoxes, really is what I want to say, with, copyright and privacy issues, but also the, opportunity to increase productivity, the opportunity to increase, data analysis across the board. You do not need to be a stats geek any longer to, find out the influence of, engagement on attrition. There are literally platforms now that you can ask that will tell you that. And so with the next slide here, I forgot. Yeah. So the underlying message for people analytics leaders is know thy algorithms. And so we talked about bias before with Eric. People analytics leaders need to know on the back end what is going on in the actual metrics that are involved in producing these predictions. So essentially, we're talking largely about predictions. And so although it democratizes data and puts data analysis in the hands across the board of organizations leaders, even without that stats degree, right? It's the people analytics leaders who need to know what's happening on the back end to control for bias and make sure that the information that's being trained on is secure and is getting to the right people and making sure that those permissions are in place. So with that, we have a poll question. Eric.
Yeah, while people are answering the poll, I'll let Tom go ahead and introduce that first.
Yeah, just we're curious on this topic of generative AI, which of the following best represents the readiness of your organization's HR function to use this new form of AI? So if you could quick answer the poll and then go ahead, Eric, with what you were going to say.
Yeah, I was just going to call out Beth Loken's comments in the chat where she was looking at your network analysis question. But what she was saying was that a lot of the questions that you were looking at on that previous slide were around attendance rather than performance or outcomes, or understanding the business case for in-person time. Curious why the focus on measuring attendance seems like that's more of an ask for those leaders who want in-office time more than true evaluation of the model. So what are your response to that?
I think that's a really good point. And I think this also, the questions that are being asked, yes, in some cases, they seem definitely posed by those with a RTO perspective. But you have to remember too, that data is limited, and people analytics don't have access to all of the behavioral outcomes they wish. And a lot of those can be sussed out to increase, to look at the end of the day, outcomes like productivity. And, we had a huge discussion in March, the People Analytics Board, about what does productivity really mean? And it's different across the organizations, it's different across industries. Some are very matter of fact with an actual, calculation to determine productivity per employee, but others have a more nebulous vision of what productivity is. That's a bit more hard to suss out and requires a lot of holistic definitions.
Yeah, attendance is at best a proxy and maybe a poor proxy for actual productivity or outcome achievement that we would care about. So it is easy to measure. And so that's why it's probably where a lot of organizations start.
And I'd add that we're going to look into this a lot more in depth with the productivity predicament report when that comes out. We did look at what measures are being used, how you're looking at productivity, and how you're balancing it against different challenges in the workforce.
So thank you everyone that did the poll. Not surprising that over a third said no plans yet with generative AI, not ready in their organizations, but interesting to see that about a third said preparing to experiment or use this soon in the future, and 16%, about 1 out of 6, saying currently experimenting.
I think we've seen a pretty steady uptick in those as we've asked this question over time.
Yeah, it's coming fast
agree.
and furious.
It definitely is. This is an example I pulled and only slightly modified from a workforce solutions company that announced a new generative AI digital assistant for people leaders this week. It's a conventional interface trained on your people data and external workforce data, and allows you to ask questions just like this. If I needed to find an external replacement for Tom, how long would that take?
And who's this Tom guy?
It will come back with an answer. Thank you, Tom. He's irreplaceable. See, ChatGPT has a sense of humor, right? No, I added that in there. But the answer here was the one that was provided in the demo, and it really, it was able to parse out employment and market data and come back with 4 months. It would take 4 months to find a replacement for Tom, though, and then give me indications of that might actually eclipse or narrow in the future. And it had a nice sweet graph that wouldn't fit on this chart, on this page anyway. So it asks it allows you to ask these very specific questions about an individual even, but then you can ask sort of broader questions like, what is the top reason why employees are leaving my company? And it takes data from engagement, it takes data from other places, and comes back with the calculation and an answer, and in some cases a graph and chart, which are very, very handy. I want to say goes back, of course, to what I was saying previously, is that you've got to know where the data is coming from, and you've got to know what is going on behind the scenes, in the calculation and the algorithm. So the people analytics field is their minds are exploding right now. There's just a lot going on, and these platforms are proliferating. And so with that, Tom, I'll let you explain.
Yeah, and so beyond the use of AI, which obviously is on the minds of people analytics leaders and really everyone across HR, people analytics functions do a lot of different things in our organizations, and we've highlighted some of the work that they've done in these sessions that you see here in our Next Practices Weekly series. So if you missed these sessions with Greg Till from Providence, or Rachel Russell from Microsoft, or Jimmy Zhang from Takeda, all of these over the past 6 months or so, again, these are available in our recording archive, and they all touched on how these organizations are using data, using insights, using analytics to make better business decisions. So with that, let's keep this train moving, and I'm going to pick up on the Chief Learning and Talent Officer Board, which I personally am the sort of research liaison for. And back again in November, when we asked them what their top priorities were, these Chief Learning Officers and Chief Talent Officers, they indicated these 4 areas: developing leaders for the new world of work, renewing a focus on performance and outcomes, creating a culture of learning that enables upskilling. That's sort of a perennial one, but the added twist here on upskilling is a little bit more of a recent nuance. And then achieving measurable diversity, equity, and inclusion goals, as Eric spoke to earlier. This had been on the board's top priorities for the past several years, But the key here was not just setting those goals, but actually achieving more measurable goals finally. So I also would like to ask a poll question. It's basically those 4 areas plus one more that I added in, leveraging technology to drive greater learning and talent outcomes. I'm curious which of these are currently top priorities for those of you on the call. So if you don't work in learning and talent management or otherwise have no idea what the priorities would be for your organization, no need to participate here. But if you do have a good sense of it, I would love to hear from you. Which of these are top priorities right now in learning and talent management? And you can choose more than one from here. And if it's other, happy to have you select other and then maybe share in the chat something beyond these 5 that maybe is a top priority for you. We'll give folks another couple seconds to log in their results here. Thank you everyone who's already done so. And thanks everyone for continuing to participate in the chat. Please keep that going. We've had some good interactions, including people answering each other's questions. Always appreciate that sort of participation. All right, I'm going to end the poll and share out the results. And interestingly, developing leaders for the new world of work. I'm not surprised that that came in number 1. It was, in a sense, number 1 for our Chief Learning and Talent Officer Board back in November. So interesting that it still is key for many of you. We were expecting very different things from leaders now than we were, say, prior to the pandemic 5 years ago. Renewing focus on performance and outcomes. Again, we've got a study on that that's going to be coming out very soon. And then you see the other ones here, really all 5 of these getting still strong response from all of you. So thank you for chiming in on that question. As I was just mentioning, we've got our new study, the Productivity Predicament, new global study that we concluded recently. The report will be coming out soon for I4CP members. And those of you on this call will be able to get a glimpse of many of the key findings if you join us on July 13th. So a little less than a month from now, we'll have our CEO, Kevin Oakes, and our senior research analyst on our team, Molly Lombardi, who was the lead on this study. They'll be co-hosting the call with me to go through the key findings from this one. Again, that was one of those 4 priorities that we just saw from the CLTO board. I mentioned leaders being another one. This is something that was covered in our recent culture fitness study, finding that very healthy cultures have leaders that do these things. They lead by example. They're held accountable for employee outcomes. They regularly communicate the organization's values, and they address poor behavior immediately. It's just something that we find over and over in multiple studies, just how critical having the right leaders in the right positions can be in organizations. And then another one of those findings in terms of priorities for the board was around having a strong learning culture. Again, from our culture fitness study, we found that amongst the traits of fit cultures, the most frequently mentioned for fit cultures versus unfit cultures, learning came in 4th, and it was 5 times more often mentioned amongst fit cultures than unfit. So having a learning culture, very strong part of an overall strong culture. And when we dive into what a learning culture sort of is composed of, there's a lot of important behaviors and practices in organizations. Again, we've studied learning cultures going back many, many years now, but the latest findings listed these. Learning is espoused as an organizational value. It's right there with your other key values in your organization. Measuring learning effectiveness and doing that well across the board. Managers being actually rewarded for developing and then moving their talent. I'll be speaking to internal mobility again in a few minutes. Leaders practicing active listening and seeking to understand others' points of view. And then leaders who ensure that learning and best practices are really freely shared across the organization. Just some of the many attributes of a strong learning culture. Once again, wanted to highlight some of the sessions we've had here at Next Practices Weekly over the past 6 or 9 months. We had Terry Hart from Zurich, North America, Diane Holman from Virgin Pulse, Pamela Matson from Outreach, and Paul Langlois from Ecolab, all this year, actually. So these were recent sessions on either leadership development programs that we wanted to highlight or how these organizations are developing and maintaining a strong learning culture. A couple of other things I wanted to note. We've been mentioning this AI and HR study. We did have a session on generative AI that that Judy Elbers, one of our colleagues here at I4CP, and myself co-hosted. That was back in April. So if you missed that one, you could go back and check that one out. And again, we just launched a new survey on this just this week. And then also we're going to be doing a survey on, and this speaks to L&D technology specifically, a little bit later this summer. We did a study last year on your core HR, your HRIS systems. We're moving ahead with our sort of next leg of series on HR tech, and that'll be on learning and development tech. So if you're interested in that, watch for a survey from us probably in late July, early August. And in the meantime, we did have, if you're a member of I4CP, we had a flash call to get some of your input to feed into that survey. That's also recorded for members, and you can check that out at our website. All right, I'm also going to speak to the findings when we asked our talent acquisition leaders, our talent acquisition board, what their top priorities were back in November going into the new year. And they were regrouping, reimagining, and rebuilding the talent acquisition function, connecting with both external and internal talent, building capacity and gaining insight through technology and data, and thinking a bit more globally maybe than they have in the past. I want to first highlight this second one, and particularly the focusing more on internal talent. This is something that we've heard a lot from organizations for several years. We did a study on internal mobility back in 2016, and then we did another study on workforce readiness, of which internal mobility was a key component about a year and a half ago. A couple of the interesting findings. One, 39% said that for most employees in their organization, it's easier to find a job externally than internally. That's kind of a sad figure that it's that high. And then on the recruiting side, your talent acquisition side, it's easier to hire far too often from outside the organization than inside. This really speaks to a deficit of strong internal mobility practices, strong technology to support that. Both of those numbers really should be much, much lower if organizations had more of a focus on internal mobility. We found 19% of organizations, and again, this was about a year and a half ago, currently had a so-called internal talent marketplace platform. I suspect this number's ticked up a bit since then, maybe around 25% due today, because it's a hot market. A lot of organizations are using those vendors, or using Workday or their core HRIS to create an internal talent marketplace. And I thought for those of you that aren't familiar with what that is, I would show this example. This comes from our friends at Vertex Pharmaceuticals, an I4CP member company that we highlighted in a guidebook I created on internal talent mobility. And you see here the sort of four main components of their platform. They use Workday as their core HRIS, and then they use ServiceNow as a sort of employee experience layer on top of that. And what this internal marketplace enables is four things. And we'll start in the bottom left and sort of go clockwise around this semicircle. So first, it includes the competencies and the skills of the employees at their organization. They've gathered that data over time, and they've got it all included in Workday Skills Cloud. Then it lays out for employees what the possible career paths for them are if they stay with Vertex. By the way, the driver for them creating this platform was a pretty difficult situation with the retention numbers several years ago. And they decided they needed to have a platform like this to improve that situation. By now, they've gone from having sort of below industry average retention to far above industry average retention. And this kind of internal mobility platform was a big part of that success. The third main area that these marketplaces enable is job matching. In their case, they did matching both between individual skills and full-time roles, but also their skills and gigs or projects, smaller assignments that they might be assigned either for development purposes or just to further the development and productivity of the organization. And then lastly, in the bottom right, you see it also connects in with their LMS and their LXP, and they use MentorClick for mentoring support. Vertex University providing all the learning assets. So depending on what your skills are, it maps over and aligns to, well, if you're looking for this particular job or gig opportunity, this is the upskilling that you need, and these are the resources that we can provide to you. I see there in the chat, Beth, you're asking for the link to the guidebook. That is an I4CP member only resource, but if you're with a member organization, we can make sure you get that link. It's one of 3 guidebooks I've created sort of in this area. The other thing I wanted to mention from our talent acquisition board leaders, sort of covering the other three priorities that they had back in November. So besides internal mobility, the other three priorities, these were some of the practices that came out of their meeting in March at our conference that they're really pursuing to go after these priorities. You see several of them have to do with people analytics. So looping back to what Catherine was talking about from our people analytics board, leveraging data for better storytelling, more proactive pipeline through talent insights. You see some of them have to do with building out the talent acquisition function to be a stronger function in the organization. And then some of them have to do more focused on thinking a bit more globally and even globally within the organization, partnering with the different centers of excellence. Again, as we've done for the others, wanted to highlight some of the recent Next Practices weekly calls we've had that have focused on talent acquisition. We had one just last week with Grace and Christine from Vertex, the company I just highlighted. Great call there. And then some calls from some of our I4CP leaders recently as well. So again, check those out in the archive if you missed them. All right, here I'm going to turn things back over to Catherine, and let's hear a little bit about what the Total Rewards Leaders Board said were their priorities going into the new year.
Happy to, Tom. So top of mind, as you can see, is the uncertain economy and how that's going to affect Total Rewards and the work they do. Assessing equitable compensation and pay transparency. So we're talking about equity audits and, of course, pay transparency regulations that have come into effect very significantly from state to state in the United States and then also in other regions of the world. Customization of compensation and benefit strategies. So personalized comp and bens is a big issue that's been forthcoming over the last couple of years, and definitely a great focus. And then in the current talent war for talent that we have, and then focusing greater attention on workforce well-being. If you want to go to the next slide, I'd like to share. This is from a recent presentation to our People Analytics Board in May from Gad Lebanon, who's the chief economist for the Burning Glass Institute. And I just wanted to show here, I mean, when we're talking about uncertain labor conditions, you can see layoffs are, as of May, like you could see, we're starting to lag and follow what we saw in the tech sector really starting at the top of the year. And so that is cause for concern, but we still have what is a very tight labor market. And one of the things Gad talked about is that is because we are seeing far fewer workers age 55 and older returning to work as we emerge from the pandemic, and as well as demographics. Our population is declining, our birth rate is declining, excuse me. So we're dealing with that issue. And so you're going to have a tight labor market kind of going forward perpetually. And so as this all connects, of course, to pay transparency legislation that has come into effect, and you had New York City in November, but you also had California start at the top of the year. And then, of course, the EU regulations that are coming down the pike this summer. So this is happening across the globe, and it's creating a lot of concern and some headache, frankly, for Total Rewards leaders. So one of the problems of this, of course, is that, as this legislation is implemented, a lot of, employees are learning, what they earn compared to their peers and not exactly satisfied. So at the start of the year, we had a flash call with a couple of Total Rewards leaders on this very topic. And as they prepared to implement see California's law go into effect at the start of the year, these were the things that were top of mind and that were recommended organizations do. So if you're not there yet, but pay transparency is being discussed in your state, for instance, or your region, these are great things to keep in mind. Doing first an assessment, and what is your current state of equity, really? Having pay equity in place, or at least a plan in place when transparency laws come into effect is critical. Because that is when employees start seeing the disparities, and there's a lot of unhappiness, there's a lot of frustration, and there's oftentimes a lot of attrition. So making sure you don't have any scary areas, right? Take care of those first. And you can see that internal pay audit, equity audit was one of the top strategies of leaders when we did our talent imperative study last spring. A lot of leaders were doing that in preparation for these laws to take effect. ensuring leaders and managers can speak to the why and address employee and candidate requests and questions. So there is a huge need to upskill leaders to understand the compensation philosophy of the organization, which has not been transparent in so many organizations for years. So there's a lot of education that's happening, but then they also need to understand how to talk about it with employees, and change management. So we're seeing a lot of culture change as a result of these regulations and what they're forcing. So making sure that you have a plan in place to address culture is really important. This next poll that we would love to have you take is just to get an understanding and assessment of how many of you provide pay rates or pay ranges for job postings. And while people are answering that poll, I will post a quick article that we wrote on pay transparency and preparing for the California law, as well as a flash call that I referenced. I'll make sure that those are in the chat.
Thanks everyone for taking the poll. I'm going to close it here in just a couple seconds and get Catherine's reaction to it. All right, let's see these results. Looks like close to 50%, 45%. Said that yes, they do provide pay rates and pay ranges for all positions. Others, yes, but only for certain positions, some only in certain locales that require it, 20% there. Thoughts on this, Catherine?
Yes, it is very different from the poll that we took during that flash call that I just posted, where you saw the majority of respondents were yes, but only in locales that require it. And that itself was a big change from the pay transparency data that we had from 2021. And so you're definitely seeing a trend, I think, towards full pay transparency for all positions. And some of the organizations that were really on the forefront of pay transparency, they were ready for California's law. They were still having trouble with pay transparency on a global scale, and understanding why people in Manila, making it clear that people in Manila make this and people in California make this. And if you go to the next slide, part of this issue is personalized compensation plans. That has become really important, or total rewards leaders have been talking about it more and more and more over the last couple of years as the labor market gets tight, understanding that one salary, one size does not fit all. And you have some who employ more, better benefits and less salary, maybe they've got a family, others who really, they're motivated by bonuses. And at the end of the day, you still need to provide evidence of pay equity for a lot of different bodies of regulation and so forth, and also understand, comply with these pay transparency laws. And so again, it goes to making sure that your managers understand, how to personalize benefits work. There's pay transparency across the board, so you can see that, Sally has, Sally's in the same position as Joe, but they're paid differently, and it's roughly equitable or not. In some cases you have people moving to different locations, and so they're going to be paid, based on a geo span, and have to understand why they're taking a pay cut. So all of this really speaks to the importance of transparency of the compensation philosophy. And that last slide was another smart compensation platform that popped up this week, and it was just showing you how you basically can ask a question and it'll show you all of the different, it'll show you equity, it'll show you pay matrix. It can help you personalize plans. So generative AI is really exploding on how a lot of this affects the total rewards field. Tom?
Yeah, that's certainly something that we're seeing really everywhere across HR. When we did the survey of priorities and predictions back in November, ChatGPT wasn't on really anyone's mind, except those, at OpenAI that were working on it. Certainly none of us, though. So that's the biggest change over the past 6 months. Again, we've covered total rewards and employee experience and related topics on a lot of Next Practices weekly calls in the past 6 months. So just wanted to highlight a few of them here. And then last, but certainly not least, can't forget the leaders of HR, the Chief Human Resource Officer. So in the few minutes we have left, I'm going to focus in on just a couple of the priorities that they indicated from their higher level perch, if you will, at the head of our people operations. You see them listed here. Back in November, they said staying on the talent offensive and ensuring talent alignment, tight alignment to organizational strategy was a top priority, refocusing the employee value prop, avoiding burnout, and building and rewarding what they called ambidextrous leaders, those that can really be agile and also deal with seeming paradoxes that are in front of them. So I wanted to highlight just a couple of things here. First, on the burnout front, again, highlighting a call we had recently here with Rob Cross and Karen Dillon, the authors of the new book, The Microstress Effect. Obviously, burnout often comes from big, obvious moments of stress in our lives, things that are significant and are clear to any objective observer. But often they come from so-called microstresses, those moments of stress that are triggered by the people in our professional and personal lives that are maybe so routine that we barely register them, but whose cumulative toll can really be debilitating. And Rob and Karen have done a lot of great research, hundreds of interviews with leaders to find out more about this. They went into the neuroscience of it, and they shared a lot of the great findings from their work on that call back on April 20th. The other area, it wouldn't be an I4CP call if we didn't talk a little bit more to close out on culture. Again, our culture fitness study, definitely top of mind for chief people officers, chief human resource officers. Key finding from that study was that high performance organizations are nearly 6 times more likely to have fit cultures than their lower performance organization counterparts. A couple of other key findings: when we looked at the data, we found that a fit culture is one that's employee focused, inclusive, focuses on quality. So sort of a traditional measure there. We already spoke to learning culture and its importance, as well as being innovative and collaborative. We also detailed in that study the 7 habits, as we're calling them, of very healthy cultures. You see that list here. But for those that maybe aren't seeing the slide, I'll just read them off quickly. More flexible work arrangements, a learning mindset, boards, there are organization boards that really care about the culture of the organization, maybe demand metrics in ways that they didn't in the past. Leaders who lead by example, leaders who are held accountable for employee outcomes, not just their bottom line and productivity numbers. Leaders who regularly communicate the values of the organization, including cultural values, and then poor behavior that gets addressed immediately. Again, those were the 7 habits of very healthy cultures found in our culture fitness study. Just progressing here, wanted to again share, we've had a lot of sessions that focus on culture in organizations, including 2 actually, with our CEO, Kevin Oakes, and our very own Catherine Brecken, who's been with us today. The most recent one there was on May 18th. So if you missed that one and would like more on culture fitness, a lot of details there. And we've had some great guests as well over the past 6 or 9 months coming in and speaking to both culture and their broader HR strategy. So with that, let me close things out because we're at the end of our hour. First, I want to thank Eric Davis and thank you, Catherine Brecken. You've been great co-hosts today, shared a lot of helpful insights for everyone on the call. So thank you both. And then I'll note too, one more time, our AI and HR study. We've talked a lot about AI today. This just launched last night or maybe this morning. AI and HR, implications and opportunities. We would love it if everyone on the call please took that survey. Again, you'll get real-time data back and also the aggregated data once that's available. Thanks everyone for participating today. It was a little bit of a different call than we've had in the past. We'll be back to having some guests with us starting again next week. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Have a great weekend. Hope to see you again in the future. Bye-bye now.